In a pristine suburban driveway, a 68-year-old construction company owner was about to confront the most painful betrayal of her life. What started as a routine Sunday dinner took a shocking turn when they came face to face with an ultimatum that would shatter 3 decades of sacrifice. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical immigrant grandmother. For 30 years, she had spent her life building an empire from nothing, known for her unwavering determination and the ability to create dream homes with her own hands. When she encountered her daughter-in-law's casual dismissal, "You wouldn't fit in," she had no idea she was walking into the ultimate test of family loyalty. Margaret's silence that would lead to a revelation that would expose the true foundation of respect. What began as excitement over a housewarming party would become a reckoning with prejudice, sacrifice, and the true meaning of home. The perfect house on Sycamore Drive would never be the same after Margaret decided to reveal the shocking truth about who really built their dream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen stepped through the morning mist that clung to the construction site, her practiced eye scanning every detail of the nearly completed house. The California sun was just beginning to burn through the fog, casting long shadows across the carefully manicured lot. At 68, Margaret still moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had built an empire one project at a time. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Marcus Johnson called out from where he was installing the final piece of crown molding around the front entrance. His weathered hands worked with the precision that had made him her most trusted site supervisor for the past 8 years. "Morning, Marcus." Margaret's voice carried the slight accent that 30 years in America had softened but never erased. She climbed the front steps, her fingers trailing along the custom banister she had personally selected. "How are we coming along?" "Right on schedule. The kitchen backsplash goes in today, and the final coat of paint in the master bedroom tomorrow." Marcus straightened, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "This is some beautiful work, Mrs. Chen. The young couple's going to love it." The young couple. Margaret's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and anticipation. If only Marcus knew that the young couple was her son David and his fiancée Rebecca. She had kept the secret for 6 months now, ever since David had mentioned, in passing, that they were looking for a house in this exact neighborhood. Margaret walked through the front door, her footsteps echoing in the spacious foyer. The hardwood floors gleamed under the temporary lighting, and the afternoon sun would soon stream through the custom bay window she had insisted on adding to the living room. Every detail had been chosen with David and Rebecca in mind. The extra deep kitchen cabinets for David's height, the walk-in closet Rebecca had admired in a magazine, the small office nook perfect for David's computer setup. She paused in the kitchen, running her hand along the granite countertop. The stone was cool beneath her palm, solid and enduring. Like everything she had built since arriving in America, with nothing but determination and her late husband's steady hands to guide her. 1995. The textile factory in San Francisco's industrial district. The smell of dyes and the constant hum of machinery. Margaret's fingers, quick and nimble from years of sewing, learning to read blueprints during her lunch breaks. James laughing as she practiced measuring cuts on scraps of wood in their tiny apartment, saying his wife was going to build them a castle someday. "Mrs. Chen?" Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The electrical inspector just left. Everything passed with flying colors." "Good." Margaret smiled, though her thoughts were still caught between past and present. "Make sure the landscapers understand about the rose bushes. They go along the east side of the house, where the morning light hits." "Yes, ma'am. Same variety as the ones in your garden?" Margaret nodded. She had grown those roses from cuttings her mother had smuggled from Taiwan in a coffee tin, wrapped in damp cloth and prayers. Now they would bloom outside David's bedroom window, a piece of their family's journey rooted in American soil. The drive to David's apartment took 20 minutes through the familiar streets of Palo Alto. Margaret had watched this city transform from sleepy suburban communities into the heart of Silicon Valley. She had built homes for tech executives and software engineers, each project adding to the reputation of Chen and Associates Construction. What had started as weekend side jobs while she worked at the factory had become a company employing 52 people. David's building was one of those modern complexes that had sprouted like mushrooms after the tech boom. All clean lines and glass, expensive but somehow lacking warmth. Margaret climbed to the third floor, her arms full of groceries for the dinner she insisted on cooking every Sunday. "Ma!" David opened the door before she could knock, his face lighting up with the same smile that had charmed teachers and soccer coaches throughout his childhood. At 32, he still had that eager quality that made people want to help him succeed. "Did you bring the wontons?" Rebecca appeared behind him, her smile bright and perfect. She was undeniably beautiful, tall, with the kind of polished elegance that Margaret recognized from the magazines in the checkout line at the grocery store. "Of course." Margaret handed over the bag, accepting Rebecca's quick peck on the cheek. "And the green beans you like, David." The apartment smelled like expensive candles and the faint chemical scent of cleaning products. Everything was in its place, from the matching throw pillows to the carefully arranged coffee table books. Margaret couldn't help but think of her own home, where 20 years of business documents still covered the dining room table and mud from construction sites occasionally tracked across the kitchen floor. "So," Margaret said as they settled around the small dining table, 3 weeks until the wedding. "How are the preparations coming?" David reached for Rebecca's hand. "We're still looking at houses. Rebecca found this amazing place in Menlo Park, but the asking price is—" He shrugged helplessly. "It's our dream home," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a note of frustration. 4 bedrooms, a proper dining room, that gorgeous kitchen. But David thinks we should wait until we can afford something without stretching our budget." Margaret watched her son's face as he navigated between his natural caution and his desire to make Rebecca happy. She had seen this pattern emerging over the past year, David's attempts to please everyone while avoiding any decision that might cause conflict. "Maybe something will work out," Margaret said carefully. "Sometimes the right opportunity appears when you least expect it." Rebecca's expression brightened. "That's what I keep telling him. We just need to take the chance when it comes." The conversation shifted to wedding details, flowers, music, the final head count for the reception. Margaret listened, offering opinions when asked, but her mind kept drifting to the house that would be finished in 2 weeks. The surprise that would give David and Rebecca everything they wanted, built with her own hands and 30 years of accumulated expertise. After dinner, as David walked her to her car, Margaret noticed the tension in his shoulders. "Everything all right, son?" David glanced back at the apartment building, then sighed. "Rebecca's just excited about the wedding, about starting our life together. Sometimes I feel like I can't keep up with all her plans." "Marriage is about compromise," Margaret said gently. "Both people have to give a little." "I know, Ma, and she's right about the house. We do need more space. I just wish—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "Never mind, it'll work out." Margaret squeezed his arm. "It will. Trust me." As she drove home through the quiet suburban streets, Margaret allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. In 2 weeks, David would sign the deed to his dream house. Rebecca would have her 4 bedrooms and granite countertops. And Margaret would watch her son's face light up with the same joy he had shown as a boy when she surprised him with a bicycle she had saved for months to buy. The house was more than wood and stone and carefully chosen fixtures. It was 30 years of dawn shifts at the factory, of studying trade manuals by lamplight, of proving herself on job sites where her accent and gender made some people doubt her competence. It was James's memory living on in every straight line and solid foundation she built. It was her love for David made manifest in drywall and plumbing, in the secret knowledge that home was something you built with your own hands, piece by careful piece. Tomorrow she would return to the site and watch Marcus install the final touches. The roses would be planted, the house would be ready, and Margaret Chen, who had learned to dream in English but still prayed in Mandarin, would give her son the most beautiful gift she had ever created. She had no way of knowing that in 3 months she would be sitting in her car across the street from that same house, uninvited to the housewarming party, watching strangers celebrate in rooms she had built with love. The wedding photos still sat in their silver frames on Margaret's mantelpiece, David's joy radiating from behind the glass like captured sunlight. 3 months had passed since that perfect September day when she had watched her son marry Rebecca in the garden of the Menlo Park Country Club. 3 months since she had handed over the keys to their new house, seeing David's face transform with wonder as he realized what she had done for them. But the warmth of that memory felt increasingly distant as Margaret sat in her kitchen on a Tuesday evening, staring at her phone. The barbecue invitation had come through the neighborhood. Group chat. Rebecca's perfectly crafted message about a casual get-together for close family and friends at their new house. Everyone was invited. Tommy and his wife Lisa, David's college friends, even Mrs. Patterson from next door, who had somehow made it onto Rebecca's social list. Everyone except Margaret. She read the message again, searching for some oversight, some technical glitch that might explain why her name wasn't on the list. But there was no mistake. Rebecca's message was followed by a string of enthusiastic responses, people confirming attendance, asking what to bring. David had even replied, "Can't wait! Rebecca's planning something special for the garden." Margaret set the phone down with careful precision, the same way she had learned to place tools after a long day on a construction site. No sudden movements. No wasted energy on actions that couldn't change the outcome. The sound of her neighbor's lawnmower drifted through the window, ordinary and constant. Life continuing its steady rhythm while hers seemed to have developed an uncomfortable skip. Maybe she simply forgot, Margaret told herself. Maybe the group message didn't include everyone it should have. But even as she formed the thought, she knew it wasn't true. Rebecca's social media presence was meticulous, her event planning legendary among their circle. Rebecca didn't forget details. The next morning, Margaret drove to the Chen & Associates office with a familiar weight settling in her chest. The construction company had grown from the spare bedroom of her first house to a modern building on the outskirts of Palo Alto, complete, with drafting tables, project management software, and a conference room that could seat 20 people. Elena Rodriguez was already at her desk when Margaret arrived, surrounded by blueprints and coffee cups. "You look like someone stole your favorite hammer," Elena said without looking up from the foundation specs she was reviewing. After 20 years of partnership, she could read Margaret's moods in the way other people read weather patterns. Margaret poured herself coffee from the machine Elena had insisted they buy after too many years of instant coffee and construction site thermoses. "Rebecca's having a barbecue this weekend. Sounds nice. David loves it when you grill those ribs with the sauce his father taught you. I wasn't invited." Elena's pen stopped moving across the blueprint. She looked up, dark eyes sharp with the same intelligence that had made her Margaret's first hire and eventual business partner. "What do you mean, not invited?" Margaret showed her the group message on her phone. Elena read it twice, her expression growing more incredulous with each word. "This is bullshit, Margaret." "Language, Elena." "No, I'm serious. This is complete bullshit." Elena stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked their current project, a custom home for a tech executive who had specifically requested Chen & Associates because of their reputation for quality and integrity. "You built their house with your own hands, and she doesn't invite you to a barbecue?" Margaret sank into the chair across from Elena's desk. "Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe nothing." Elena turned from the window, her voice carrying the authority that made subcontractors scramble to meet her deadlines. How long has this been going on? The question hung in the air like sawdust after a cut. Margaret realized she had been cataloging the slights for weeks without wanting to name them. Small things, she said finally. Dinner invitations that don't come. Phone calls that go to voicemail and don't get returned for days. Last week, she corrected my English in front of their friends. Corrected your... Elena's voice climbed an octave. Your English is better than most native speakers I know. You negotiate million-dollar contracts. She said I pronounce drawer wrong, made a joke about old habits dying hard. Elena sat down heavily, as if the weight of this revelation was too much to bear standing. And David? What does David say about all this? Margaret's chest tightened. He says Rebecca's just adjusting to married life. That she's stressed about her new promotion at work. He makes excuses. The admission felt like a betrayal of her son, even though it was the truth. David had developed an arsenal of explanations for Rebecca's behavior, each one delivered with the sheepish smile of someone who knew he was making excuses, but couldn't quite stop himself. Margaret. Elena leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You need to talk to him. Really talk to him. Before Margaret could respond, the office door chimed, and Tommy Chen walked in carrying coffee and a box of pastries from the bakery down the street. At 35, Tommy had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's steady temperament, qualities that made him an excellent foreman and an even better nephew. Morning, ladies. Brought fuel for the Tuesday planning meeting. He set the box on Elena's desk, then noticed the tension in the room. Everything okay? Elena and Margaret exchanged glances. Tommy had always been protective of Margaret, ever since he was 12, and started working summer jobs at construction sites. He called her Aunt Margaret, even though she was technically his father's cousin, a generational confusion that had sorted itself out through years of family dinners and shared work. Your cousin David's wife is being an ass, Elena said bluntly. Elena, Margaret warned. What? She is. Elena turned to Tommy. Tell him about the barbecue. Margaret reluctantly explained the situation, while Tommy's expression grew darker. She had seen that look before, usually when someone tried to shortchange their workers or questioned Margaret's competence on a job site. That's not okay, Tommy said when she finished. That's really not okay. It's probably just a misunderstanding. Aunt Margaret, with respect, you taught me to recognize shoddy work when I see it. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is deliberate. The conversation was interrupted by Margaret's phone buzzing. David's name appeared on the screen, and she felt a flutter of hope. Maybe he was calling to clarify the barbecue situation, to apologize for the oversight. Hi, honey. Hey, Ma. Listen, I can't do Sunday dinner this week. Rebecca's planning this barbecue thing, and she's got me running around getting supplies. The hope deflated like a punctured tire. Of course, I understand. Maybe we can do lunch next week instead, just the two of us? There it was again, the subtle separation, the implication that Rebecca's presence was now the exception rather than the rule. Margaret found herself agreeing to lunch, while part of her mind catalogued this as another small erosion in their relationship. After she hung up, Tommy and Elena were both watching her with expressions of sympathy and frustration. He didn't mention the barbecue, Elena observed. He didn't invite you, Tommy added, his voice tight with controlled anger. Margaret stood up, smoothing her slacks with hands that had built homes and businesses, but suddenly felt inadequate for navigating family politics. I should get to the Riverside project. The foundation inspection is at 10. She gathered her things while Elena and Tommy exchanged meaningful looks. They were plotting something. Probably a conversation with David, possibly a confrontation with Rebecca. Margaret could feel their protective instincts activating like a security system. Just be careful, she said as she reached the door. David's caught in the middle of this. I don't want to make it worse for him. The drive to the Riverside project took her through the neighborhood where David and Rebecca lived. Without consciously deciding to, Margaret found herself slowing as she passed their house. The landscaping was maturing beautifully, the roses she had planted blooming in cheerful abundance along the east wall. The driveway held Rebecca's white BMW and David's hybrid sedan, parked side by side like an advertisement for successful young marriage. Margaret was about to drive on when she heard voices from the backyard. Rebecca's laugh, bright and artificial, followed by another woman's voice, Sarah Kim, probably, Rebecca's best friend and frequent companion for shopping trips and wine tastings. Honestly, sometimes I think David will never cut the apron strings. His mother calls every day, shows, up with groceries we didn't ask for. It's like she can't accept that he's a grown man with his own life now. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She should drive away. She should not listen to this conversation. But some masochistic impulse kept her frozen in place. Maybe she's just lonely, Sarah's voice suggested. Didn't her husband die a few years ago? 8 years ago, Rebecca corrected, her tone dismissive. Look, I understand she's been important in David's life, but there's such a thing as healthy boundaries. I mean, we're newlyweds. We need space to build our own traditions, our own social circle. I can't have her hovering over every dinner party, correcting my pronunciation, telling stories about the old country. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. The old country. As if her history, her journey, her sacrifices were quaint folklore rather than the foundation that had made David's success possible. She drove away before she could hear more, but the damage was done. The conversation played on repeat in her mind as she walked through the Riverside project, checking measurements and inspecting joints with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Each perfect angle, each flush connection was proof of her competence, her worth, her right to respect. But competence at work couldn't fill the growing hollow in her chest where her relationship with her son used to be. That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with the barbecue invitation still glowing on her phone screen. Around her, the house held the comfortable silence of a life built carefully over decades. Photos of David at various ages lined the refrigerator. His college diploma hung framed in the hallway, evidence of a mother's pride displayed like medals of honor. But for the first time since David's wedding, Margaret allowed herself to wonder if love was enough. If the foundation she had built for their relationship was strong enough to withstand the pressure Rebecca was applying, one calculated slight at a time. The roses outside her kitchen window swayed in the evening breeze, their blooms heavy with the promise of beauty that would outlast the season. Like everything else she had built, they were made to endure. She just wasn't sure the same could be said for her place in David's life. The Sunday dinner tradition had survived Margaret's immigration, James's death, David's college years, and the early months of his marriage. Every week, without fail, David would arrive at Margaret's house with an appetite and stories from his week, settling into the same chair he'd claimed as a teenager while she bustled around the kitchen preparing his favorite dishes. This particular Sunday, Rebecca came too, a rare occurrence that had Margaret humming as she arranged extra place settings and added more vegetables to the steamer. Maybe the recent distance had been in her imagination. Maybe today would mark a return to the warmth they'd shared during the engagement. Margaret had spent the morning preparing. Wontons made from scratch, the green beans David loved with garlic and soy sauce, and a whole fish steamed with ginger the way James used to make it. The kitchen smelled like memory and possibility. Something. Smells incredible, David said as he kissed her cheek, his familiar warmth cutting through the anxiety she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Rebecca followed behind him, her smile bright and perfectly calibrated. She wore a flowing sundress that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. Her hair swept into an effortless updo that had clearly taken considerable effort to achieve. "Mrs. Chen, you've outdone yourself again," Rebecca said, accepting Margaret's embrace with the kind of careful politeness reserved for distant acquaintances. They settled around the dining room table, the same one where Margaret had helped David with homework, where she'd spread construction blueprints late into the night, where she'd eaten countless solitary dinners after James's death. Now it felt properly full again. 3 generations of dreams and aspirations gathered over shared food. "So," David said, serving himself a generous portion of fish, "we've finally set a date for the housewarming party." Margaret's chopsticks paused halfway to her mouth. "A housewarming party?" "We've been putting it off for months," Rebecca chimed in, her voice bubbling with excitement. "But we finally bit the bullet and sent out the invitations. 3 weeks from Saturday." Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. A housewarming party. For the house she had built with her own hands, planned with her own vision, gifted with her own love. The irony was so profound it made her dizzy. "How wonderful," she managed. "I'd love to help with the preparations. I could make some appetizers. Or maybe help with decorations." "Oh, that's so sweet of you to offer," Rebecca interrupted, her tone suggesting anything but sweetness. "But we've already got everything handled. It's going to be a pretty specific crowd. Young professionals mostly. People from David's work. Some of my marketing colleagues. You know how these things are." Margaret blinked, certain she had misunderstood. "I'm sorry?" Rebecca's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "The guest list is pretty much set. We're keeping it small, focused on our peer group. I'm sure you understand." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She looked to David, waiting for him to clarify, to laugh and tell Rebecca she was being ridiculous, to insist that of course his mother would be invited to their housewarming party. Instead, David stared at his plate, his chopsticks moving vegetables around without actually eating them. "David?" Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. He looked up, his face flushed with the particular shade of red that had appeared whenever he was caught between conflicting loyalties as a child. "Mom, it's just..." "Rebecca's right about the guest list. It's mostly people our age, you know, work friends, and I wouldn't fit in," Margaret finished, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "It's not that you wouldn't fit in," Rebecca said quickly, though her tone suggested that was exactly what she meant. "It's just that the dynamic would be different with, family there. People tend to act differently around parents. We want everyone to feel relaxed." Margaret set her chopsticks down with the same careful precision she used when handling delicate materials on a job site. 30 years of construction work had taught her that some structures, no matter how well built, could collapse under the right pressure applied to the wrong point. "I see." The silence that followed felt dangerous, like the moment before a support beam snaps. David cleared his throat. "Mom, it's nothing personal. We'll have you over for dinner right after, just the 3 of us. We can give you a proper tour then." A proper tour of the house she had designed, built, gifted to them out of love so profound it had taken 6 months of secret planning and every spare moment she could steal from her business. "Of course," Margaret said, rising from her chair with movements. That felt mechanical, disconnected from her body. "I should let you 2 get back to your planning." "Mom, don't..." David started to stand, but Rebecca's hand on his arm stopped him. "We haven't finished dinner," Rebecca said brightly, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. "And I wanted to tell you about the caterer we hired. They're doing this amazing fusion menu that's supposed to be very trendy right now." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, searching for some sign of the boy who had once defended a classmate from bullies, who had cried when their neighbor's cat died, who had spent hours at construction sites learning to measure and cut and build. That boy would have stood up. That boy would have said something, but that boy was gone. replaced by a man who chose the path of least resistance, who had learned that avoiding conflict was easier than fighting for what was right. "Enjoy your dinner," Margaret said, already moving toward the kitchen to gather her purse and keys. "Let me know how the party goes." She made it to her car before the tears started. Not the gentle tears of sentiment or nostalgia, but the harsh, choking sobs of someone whose heart was breaking in real time. She sat in her driveway for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, trying to reconcile the magnitude of the insult with the matter-of-fact way it had been delivered. Not invited to the housewarming party. For the house she had built. As a gift. Out of love. When she could finally see clearly enough to drive, Margaret headed straight to Elena's house. Her business partner lived in a modest bungalow that she had been slowly renovating for the past 5 years, approaching each project with the same methodical care she brought to their construction jobs. Elena took one look at Margaret's face and poured 2 glasses of wine without asking questions. "Tell me," she said simply. Margaret told her everything: the casual announcement, Rebecca's dismissive tone, David's failure to defend her, the suffocating realization that she had become an embarrassment to the son she had sacrificed everything to raise. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When Margaret finished, Elena was quiet for a long moment, swirling wine in her glass with the intensity of someone contemplating violence. "You have to tell them," Elena said finally. "Tell them what?" "About the house, about Chen and Associates, about the fact that Rebecca just uninvited you from a party celebrating a house you built with your own hands." Margaret shook her head. "I can't do that to David. He'll feel terrible." "He should feel terrible," Elena interrupted. "Margaret, listen to me. You built that house. Every beam, every joint, every custom detail. You designed the kitchen Rebecca cooks in, the bedroom where they sleep, the garden where they're planning to entertain their friends. And she just told you that you don't belong there." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret thought about the months of planning, the late nights reviewing blueprints, the careful selection of fixtures and finishes. She thought about Marcus installing crown molding and asking about the young couple. She thought about the roses planted along the east wall, grown from cuttings that connected their family's journey across an ocean and 30 years of American dreams. "What if telling them makes it worse?" Margaret asked. "What if Rebecca turns David against me completely?" Elena leaned forward, her dark eyes fierce. "Margaret, she's already turning him against you. You're just too dignified to fight back." After leaving Elena's house, Margaret found herself driving through the familiar streets of David and Rebecca's neighborhood. She hadn't intended to go there, but grief and habit had conspired to guide her car toward the house that represented everything she had built and everything she was losing. The street was quiet in the gathering dusk, most houses glowing warmly from within as families settled into their evening routines. Margaret parked across the street from the house, far enough away to avoid notice, but close enough to see every detail she remembered creating. The porch light illuminated the custom woodwork around the front door. The bay window she had insisted on adding to the living room glowed softly, and she could see figures moving inside. David and Rebecca, probably planning their party for young professionals. People who would never know that every comfort they enjoyed had been built by the hands of a woman they'd never meet. As Margaret watched, Rebecca appeared in the kitchen window, gesturing animatedly as she spoke on the phone, probably talking to the caterer about the amazing fusion menu. Planning entertainment for rooms Margaret had measured and framed and finished with love. A light came on in what she knew was the master bedroom, the room where she had installed extra soundproofing, thinking about David's love of music and his consideration for neighbors. Rebecca moved past the window, her silhouette briefly visible before the blinds closed. Margaret sat in her car until full darkness fell, watching, her greatest achievement being lived in by people who had just made it clear she wasn't welcome to celebrate it. The irony was so complete it felt almost artistic, a masterpiece of unintended cruelty. When she finally drove home, Margaret's phone showed 3 missed calls from David and 2 from Elena. But she wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. She needed time to sit with this new reality, to understand what it meant for a mother to be excluded from her son's life while living daily with the evidence of everything she had sacrificed for his happiness. The roses in her garden were blooming magnificently, their scent heavy in the night air. She cut a small bouquet and brought them inside, placing them in a vase on her kitchen table where she could see them while she tried to decide what kind of woman she wanted to be in response to this betrayal. A woman who stayed silent to keep the peace? Or a woman who finally demanded the respect she had earned through 30 years of building dreams with her own hands? The roses offered no answers, but their beauty reminded her that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. The knock on Margaret's door came at precisely 10 o'clock Monday morning, accompanied by the sound of a walker scraping against the front steps. Through the peephole, Margaret could see Mrs. Patterson's silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, her neighbor's sharp blue eyes surveying the street with the vigilance of someone who had appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood watch. "I brought tea," Mrs. Patterson announced when Margaret opened the door, holding up a thermos and a small paper bag. "Earl Grey, and those shortbread cookies from the Scottish bakery downtown." At 78, Evelyn Patterson moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body had begun to betray her, but whose mind remained razor-sharp. She had taught 5th grade for 43 years before retiring, and she still carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. "Mrs. Patterson, how lovely. Please, come in." Margaret led her into the living room, noting how her neighbor's eyes swept over the family photos and construction awards that lined the walls. Mrs. Patterson settled into the armchair that had been James's favorite, arranging her walker within easy reach with the efficiency of long practice. "You're wondering why I'm here, Mrs. Patterson said, pouring tea from her thermos into the cups Margaret had brought from the kitchen. 40 years I've lived on this street. 40 years of watching families come and go, children grow up, marriages succeed and fail. You learn to read the signs." Margaret accepted her tea, grateful for something to do with her hands. "I'm not sure I follow." "Yesterday afternoon, I watched your son leave your house looking like a man who'd been kicked by his own horse. 20 minutes later, you left, looking like you'd been the one doing the kicking, except your face said otherwise." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the gentle precision she had probably used to extract confessions from guilty students. "Then, this morning, I see your nephew's truck in your driveway at 7 a.m., and I hear raised voices from next door when that boy of yours gets home from work." Margaret nearly choked on her tea. "You heard?" Sound carries in these old neighborhoods. Thin walls, windows that don't quite close properly. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "Your nephew Tommy has quite a vocabulary when he's angry." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. She had no idea Tommy had gone to confront David. When he'd called that morning asking if she was okay, she'd assured him she was fine, that it was just a family misunderstanding. Apparently, Tommy had drawn his own conclusions. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm sorry if the noise disturbed." "Child," the older woman interrupted. "I raised 3 boys and taught elementary school for 4 decades. I've heard worse language from kindergartners with skinned knees." She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "What I haven't seen in all those years is a woman like you being treated with such disrespect by her own family." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I know about the house, dear." Margaret's cup rattled against its saucer. "The house?" "The one your company built for David and his wife. I make it my business to know what happens in the neighborhood." Chen and Associates Construction. "I've seen your trucks, your workers, your nephew supervising the job. Beautiful work, by the way. Those roses you planted are the envy of every gardener. On the street, Margaret stared at her neighbor, this woman who had always been a polite but distant presence, someone to wave to while collecting mail or taking out trash. She had never imagined Mrs. Patterson paid such close attention to the details of her life. I also know, Mrs. Patterson continued, that you built that house as a wedding gift. And I know that your daughter-in-law has been telling people she found the perfect house through a lucky break in the market. The casual cruelty of it struck Margaret anew. Rebecca wasn't just excluding her from the housewarming party. She was actively erasing Margaret's role in creating the very home they'd be celebrating. How do you know all this? Mrs. Patterson smiled, and for a moment, Margaret could see the formidable teacher she must have been. Bridge club, garden society meetings, neighborhood book club. Amazing what people will say when they think only their friends are listening. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Speaking of which, I thought you might want to see this. It was a printed invitation, elegantly designed with Rebecca's perfect aesthetic sense. Join us for a housewarming celebration as we open our dream home to friends and family. Below that, details about catering, a bartender, even a small jazz quartet for entertainment. Margaret read through the guest list printed on the back, recognizing names from David's work, Rebecca's marketing firm, several neighbors she barely knew. The scale of the event was impressive and expensive. Quite the production, Mrs. Patterson observed. Professional photography, too, according to what Rebecca told the Hendersons yesterday. Something about wanting to document the perfect party. In their perfect home. The perfect home that Margaret had built with her own hands, designed with her own vision, given with her own love. And she would be watching from across the street, if she watched at all. Mrs. Patterson, why are you telling me this? The older woman set down her teacup and leaned back in the chair, studying Margaret with eyes that had seen decades of human behavior in all its complexity. Because, dear, I've spent my whole life watching bullies. In my classroom. In the faculty. Lounge in the neighborhood committees. And the one thing I've learned is that bullies only stop when someone makes them stop. She paused, her voice growing softer. Your daughter-in-law is a bully, Margaret. A very polite, very pretty bully, but a bully nonetheless. Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Emergency coffee meeting. Now, I found something out. 20 minutes later, Margaret sat across from Elena at their usual corner table in the cafe near the construction office. Elena's laptop was open, and her expression carried the intensity she usually reserved for reviewing complex building permits. I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, Elena said without preamble. About Rebecca not knowing that you built the house, so I did some digging. She turned the laptop screen toward Margaret, showing a series of documents and email chains. David handled all the business arrangements for the house, right? All the contracts, the payments, the permits. Margaret nodded. She had insisted on that, wanting to keep the surprise intact until the wedding. Look at this. Elena pointed to an email thread between David and their office manager. David specifically requested that all documentation list him as the primary contact. No mention of the gift arrangement, no indication that Chen and Associates was donating the work. Margaret scanned the emails, seeing her son's careful efforts to maintain the secret. At the time, his thoroughness had seemed thoughtful, even romantic. Now it felt like evidence of something more troubling. Elena, what are you saying? I'm saying that as far as any official record shows, David Chen purchased a house from Chen and Associates Construction at market rate. Rebecca has no way of knowing you were involved unless David told her. The implications hit Margaret like a falling beam. You think he never told her? Not even after they moved in? I think, Elena said carefully, that your son has been protecting himself rather than protecting the surprise. I think he was afraid of how Rebecca would react to being given something instead of earning it herself. Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus, texting from the Current. Job site. Boss, you okay? Some of the crew are asking. Tommy's been pretty vocal about family problems. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even. Her work family was rallying around her, Margaret realized. People who had built their lives around the principles of solid construction and honest labor were watching her foundation crumble and offering their support. I need to get to the office, Margaret said, gathering her things. Marcus is probably worried I'm having some kind of breakdown. Are you? Elena asked gently. Margaret considered the question seriously. Was she breaking down? Or was she finally breaking free from the careful politeness that had kept her silent while her son's wife systematically erased her from their lives? I'm not sure yet, she admitted, but I think I'm about to find out. As she drove to the construction site, Margaret's phone rang. Sarah Kim's name appeared on the screen, which was unusual. Rebecca's best friend had never called Margaret directly before. Mrs. Chen? I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from David's phone. Sarah's voice carried an awkward tension that immediately put Margaret on alert. Of course, Sarah. What can I do for you? I wanted to. I heard about the housewarming party situation, and I just wanted you to know that I think there might have been a misunderstanding. Margaret pulled into the construction site parking lot but remained in her car, sensing that this conversation required her full attention. What kind of misunderstanding? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The thing is, Mrs. Chen, Rebecca talks about you sometimes, and I've been wondering if maybe some of the things she says aren't entirely fair. It was a careful admission, the kind of diplomatic phrasing that acknowledged wrongdoing without directly condemning a friend. But coming from someone in Rebecca's inner circle, it felt like vindication. I appreciate you calling, Sarah. There's something else? Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. Rebecca mentioned that you offered to help with the party preparations. I just want you to know that if I were in your position, I would have been hurt by her response. Very hurt. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her car watching the familiar rhythm of the construction site. Workers moved with purpose and precision, each person contributing to something larger than themselves. It was a kind of community she understood, built on mutual respect and shared effort. Mrs. Patterson, Elena, Tommy, Marcus, even Sarah Kim, allies emerging from unexpected places, each offering their own form of support. Margaret realized she wasn't as alone as she had felt yesterday in Rebecca's perfectly appointed dining room. But the fundamental question remained. What was she willing to do with this support? How far was she prepared to go to reclaim her place in her son's life? The answer, Margaret suspected, would determine not just her relationship with David and Rebecca, but who she chose to be in the face of disrespect. The careful, diplomatic woman who built her success by avoiding conflict, or the fighter who had immigrated to a new country and built an empire with her own hands. The construction site hummed with activity around her, full of people who respected her judgment and trusted her leadership. Maybe it was time to remind her family why she had earned that respect in the first place. Margaret parked her Honda Civic beneath the spreading oak tree on Elm Street, 3 houses down from the home she had built with her own hands. The evening air carried the sound of laughter and clinking glasses, the gentle jazz quartet she had read about on Mrs. Patterson's invitation weaving through conversations that drifted across manicured lawns. 7:30 p.m. The party was in full swing. Through her windshield, Margaret could see the warm glow spilling from every window of 1247 Sycamore Drive. The custom bay window she had insisted on adding to the living room framed silhouettes of guests holding wine glasses, their gestures animated by whatever story was being told. The porch light, a vintage-style fixture she had spent 2 hours selecting because it reminded her of the street lamps in David's favorite childhood park, illuminated couples arriving with gifts and flowers. She shouldn't be here. Margaret knew that. But she had found herself driving these familiar streets as dusk fell, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the need to see the house being used as she had always imagined. Maybe it was masochistic curiosity about the life her son was building without her. Or maybe, she admitted to herself, it was the simple desire to be close to the most beautiful thing she had ever created, even if she could only watch from a distance. A silver Audi pulled into the driveway, and Margaret recognized Rebecca's colleague from the marketing firm, the one with the perfectly highlighted hair and the laugh that carried across parking lots. She watched as the woman carefully navigated the brick walkway in her stiletto heels, probably not knowing that Margaret had insisted on that specific brick pattern because it provided better traction in wet weather. Every detail of the house told a story Margaret remembered with painful clarity. The extra-wide front door she had installed because David had always struggled with standard sizes when helping friends move furniture. The reinforced deck railing she had built to code and beyond, thinking about future grandchildren who might climb and swing from it. The kitchen island positioned at exactly the right height for David's frame, with hidden outlets she had placed after remembering how he always needed to charge his phone while cooking. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself remember the day they had installed the hardwood floors. Tommy had been running the crew, but Margaret had insisted on laying the planks in the master bedroom herself, each piece fitted with the precision of a woman who understood that this room would shelter her son's dreams, his marriage, his future. She had worked in silence that day, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of 3 decades in construction, her heart full of the quiet satisfaction that came from building something beautiful for someone you love. Now strangers were walking across those floors in expensive shoes, leaving scuff marks Margaret would never see up close, never have the chance to repair. A burst of laughter drew her attention back to the present. Through the bay window, she could see Rebecca at the center of a group of guests, her arms gesturing expressively as she told some story. Even from this distance, Margaret could see her daughter-in-law's animated confidence, the way she commanded attention and held it effortlessly. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Please tell me you're not sitting outside their house right now." She didn't reply. At 8 o'clock, the front door opened, and Rebecca stepped onto the porch with a wine glass in hand. She had changed into a flowing emerald dress that caught the porch light beautifully, her hair swept up to show off the diamond earrings David had given her for their first anniversary. Behind her, guests gathered in the doorway, and Margaret realized Rebecca was about to give some kind of speech. Margaret rolled down her window slightly, unable to resist hearing what her daughter-in-law would say about the house Margaret had poured her heart into building. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," Rebecca's voice carried clearly across the street, trained by years of marketing presentations. "When David and I first saw this house, we knew it was meant to be ours. Everything about it just felt perfect. The layout, the finishes, even the way the morning light comes through the kitchen window." Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The morning light that came through that kitchen window, because she had specifically oriented the house to catch the sunrise, knowing David had always been an early riser who liked to drink coffee while watching the world wake up. "We feel so grateful," Rebecca continued, "to have found our dream home at exactly the right moment in our lives. It's like the universe conspired to put this perfect house on the market just when we were ready for it." The universe. Not Margaret's. 6 months of secret planning, her company's craftsmanship, her gift of love made manifest in lumber and nails and carefully chosen fixtures. The universe. Margaret watched the faces of the guests, David's colleagues, Rebecca's friends, neighbors who had probably seen Chen and Associates trucks in the driveway for months, but would never connect that construction work with the woman, sitting invisible in a Honda Civic across the street. And of course, Rebecca raised her wine glass, We have to thank David for having such excellent taste in real estate." The crowd laughed and applauded. David appeared in the doorway behind. His wife, his face flushed with what Margaret hoped was embarrassment but feared was simply the effect of wine and warm weather. He smiled awkwardly and waved off the attention, but he didn't correct Rebecca's narrative. He didn't mention the months of planning, the gift aspect, the love that had gone into every decision about paint colors and cabinet hardware. He just stood there and let his wife take credit for finding what Margaret had built. A white pickup truck turned onto the street, and Margaret's heart jumped when she recognized the Chen & Associates logo on the door. Marcus drove slowly past the party, his windows down, and she could see his eyes scanning the house with the professional assessment of someone who had spent months bringing it to life. His gaze found her car, and for a moment, their eyes met, through the darkness. Marcus slowed almost to a stop, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like anger. He raised his hand slightly, not quite a wave, more of an acknowledgement, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at this small gesture of solidarity. Marcus drove on, but not before she saw him shake his head in disgust. At 8:30, the front door opened again, and David stepped outside alone. He walked to the edge of the porch, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and looked out at the street with the kind of restless energy Margaret recognized from his childhood. He used to pace the backyard like this when he was wrestling with a difficult decision or trying to work up the courage to confess some misdeed. For a wild moment, Margaret thought he might see her car, might walk across the street and invite her in to see what they had done with the house. She imagined the conversation they would have, David finally explaining to Rebecca who had really built their home, Rebecca's shock and embarrassment, perhaps even gratitude for the magnitude of the gift. But David only stood there for a few minutes before Rebecca appeared in the doorway behind him. "Honey, come back inside. The Johnsons want to see the master bedroom renovation." Master bedroom renovation. Margaret's chest tightened. They had changed something in the room she had built with such care, the space where she had laid each floorboard with her own hands while imagining her son's happiness. David glanced once more toward the street, toward her, though he couldn't possibly see her in the shadows, and then followed his wife back inside. Margaret sat in her car until nearly 10 o'clock, watching the party wind down. Guests began leaving in small groups, their voices carrying across the quiet neighborhood as they complimented Rebecca on her hosting skills, the beautiful house, the perfect evening. Several people took photos of themselves in front of the house, the porch light Margaret had chosen creating a warm backdrop for their memories of this celebration she had not been invited to attend. As the last guest departed, Margaret saw David and Rebecca moving through the house, turning off lights and probably beginning the cleanup process. The bay window went dark, then the dining room, then the kitchen where Margaret had installed extra cabinet space because Rebecca had mentioned loving to cook elaborate meals. Finally, only the porch light remained on, casting its gentle glow over the brick walkway and the rose bushes that connected this house to Margaret's own garden, to her mother's cuttings from Taiwan, to a story of immigration and sacrifice that Rebecca would never know because David had never found the courage to tell it. Margaret started her car and drove home through the quiet suburban streets, past other houses she had built, other families living in structures that bore the mark of her craftsmanship and care. But none of those houses carried the weight of tonight's betrayal, the profound injustice of being excluded from celebrating what was, quite literally, her own work. By the time she pulled into her own driveway, Margaret had made a decision. Mrs. Patterson was right. Bullies only stopped when someone made them stop. Elena was right. She deserved respect for what she had built. Tommy and Marcus were right. David's silence was enabling Rebecca's cruelty. Tomorrow, Margaret Chen would stop being the patient diplomatic woman who suffered insults in silence. Tomorrow, she would remind her family exactly who she was and what she had sacrificed for their happiness. Tomorrow, she would tell the truth about the house on Sycamore Drive, and let the consequences fall where they would. The roses in her garden rustled in the night breeze, their scent heavy with the promise of revelation. Margaret arrived at 1247 Sycamore Drive at 9:15 Monday morning, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop near David's office and a manila folder that contained 30 years of construction expertise distilled into blueprints, permits, and photographs. Rebecca's white BMW was gone from the driveway. She would be at her marketing firm, probably recounting the success of the housewarming party to colleagues who would never know the real story behind the perfect house they'd admired. David's hybrid sedan sat alone in the driveway, and Margaret could see movement in the kitchen through the window she had positioned to catch the morning light. Her son was probably having his usual breakfast, toast with peanut butter and coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, habits that hadn't changed since college. Margaret walked up the brick pathway she had designed for durability and beauty, past the rose bushes that carried her family's story in their DNA, and knocked on the front door she had built wide enough to accommodate a lifetime of furniture, moves, and family gatherings. David answered wearing the rumpled t-shirt and pajama bottoms of someone who had planned to spend the morning recovering from hosting duties. His face showed surprise, then pleasure, then the quick calculation of someone trying to determine if this visit would create complications with his wife. "Mom? What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "I brought coffee," Margaret said, holding up the cups. "I thought we should talk." David glanced back toward the kitchen, probably wondering if Rebecca had left anything around that would trigger an argument, then stepped aside to let her in. "She's at work," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Won't be back until after 5. Margaret stepped into the entry hall, and the impact of being inside the house she had built hit her with unexpected force. The hardwood floors gleamed in the morning light, every plank laid with precision and love. The crown molding that Marcus had spent 3 days installing created elegant lines that drew the eye upward. The custom built-ins she had designed specifically for David's books and music collection held the collection of a life she had watched unfold from childhood to adulthood. "Mom? You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret turned to her son, this man she had raised with such hope and sacrifice, and felt the weight of everything she had carried in silence pressing against her chest. "In a way, I have," she said. "David, we need to sit down." They settled in the living room, David on the leather sofa Rebecca had chosen, Margaret in the chair positioned to take advantage of the bay window view. She had planned that view carefully, angling it to capture both the garden and the street, thinking about how David liked to watch the world while he thought through problems. "David," Margaret began, setting the manila folder on the coffee table. Between them, "I need to tell you something about this house." Her son's expression grew wary. "What about it?" Margaret opened the folder and pulled out the original blueprints, the ones she had sketched in her own hand during late nights at the kitchen table. David's name was written in the corner, along with the date, 6 months before his wedding. "Chen and Associates didn't just build this house," Margaret said quietly. "We designed it, specifically for you and Rebecca, as a wedding gift." David stared at the blueprints, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Margaret watched understanding dawn across his face like sunrise, slow and then all at once. "Every room was planned with your lives in mind," Margaret continued, pulling out photographs from the construction process. "The kitchen island height is perfect for your frame. The master bedroom has extra soundproofing because you love music. The office has north-facing windows because you always studied better in indirect light." David set down his coffee with shaking hands. "Mom, I don't understand. When we bought the house, the paperwork said..." "The paperwork said you purchased it from Chen and Associates Construction for market value because that's what you requested," Margaret interrupted gently. "You wanted to keep the surprise until the wedding, remember? You handled all the contracts to maintain secrecy. But the money was returned to your account 3 days after the wedding. Check your bank statements from September, David. The deposit was listed as a wedding gift refund." Margaret watched her son's face cycle through confusion, realization, and then something that looked like horror as the implications sank in. "Rebecca doesn't know," he whispered. "No, David. Rebecca doesn't know. Rebecca thinks you found this house through luck and good timing. Rebecca thinks the universe conspired to put your dream home on the market at exactly the right moment." Margaret's voice remained steady, but David could hear the hurt underneath. "Rebecca gave a speech last night about how grateful you both are to have found such a perfect house." David buried his face in his hands. "Oh God. Mom, I'm so sorry. I meant to tell her after the wedding, but then she was so excited about decorating, and then with the move and her promotion, and I kept putting it off. And then it became easier to not tell her at all." The accusation hung in the air between them. David looked up, his eyes red with shame and what might have been tears. "She's been terrible to you," he said. "The barbecue, the housewarming party. God, Mom, she uninvited you from a party celebrating a house you built with your own hands." Margaret pulled out more photographs, shots of her installing the custom shelving in David's office, Tommy framing the master bedroom, Marcus carefully placing the crown molding. Evidence of months of love made manifest in wood and nails and careful craftsmanship. "This room," Margaret said, pointing to a photo of the kitchen during construction. "I installed the cabinet hardware myself. Every handle, every drawer pull. I was thinking about you making coffee in the mornings, about Rebecca cooking those elaborate meals she loves to prepare." David stared at the photograph. "The spice rack. You built the pull-out spice rack because I mentioned Rebecca liked to cook." "I built everything in this house with your happiness in mind, David. Every decision was made with love." Margaret's voice finally cracked slightly. "And yesterday your wife told me I wouldn't fit in at a party celebrating it." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the bay window Margaret had designed for moments exactly like this, when someone needed to look outside while processing difficult truths. "I have to tell her," he said. "I have to tell Rebecca everything." "Yes, you do. But David, that's not why I'm here." Her son turned back to her, confusion replacing shame on his face. "I'm not here for apologies or gratitude, though those things might be nice eventually. I'm here because I need you to understand something about respect." Margaret stood up, meeting her son's eyes with the steady gaze she had used to negotiate million-dollar contracts and manage construction crews. "For 30 years, I have built things with my hands. Buildings, businesses, a life in this country that gave you opportunities I never had. I have earned the right to be treated with dignity by my own family. Not as an embarrassment, not as someone who wouldn't fit in, but as the woman who sacrificed everything to make your success possible." David's face crumpled. "Mom, I know. I know what you've done for me, and Do you?" Margaret interrupted, "because your actions tell a different story. Your silence enabled Rebecca's cruelty. Your conflict avoidance made you complicit in my exclusion. Your failure to communicate about this house allowed your wife to erase my contribution to your happiness." The words hit David like physical blows. Margaret could see him finally understanding the magnitude of his failures, the cost of his silence. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. Margaret picked up her purse and the manila folder, leaving the photographs and blueprints scattered across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. "You fix it by deciding what kind of man you want to be, David. What kind of son. What kind of husband." She paused at the front door, her hand on the custom brass handle she had chosen, because it reminded her of the hardware in the houses she had admired as a young immigrant. "You fix it by having the courage to tell the truth, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." David followed her to the door, his face streaked with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "Mom, please, don't leave like this." Margaret turned back to her son, seeing in his face the boy who had once promised to protect her from bullies, who had sworn he would never let anyone hurt the mother who had sacrificed everything for his dreams. I love you, David. I have always loved you. But love without respect is not enough to build a family on, any more than affection without a foundation is enough to build a house. She touched his cheek gently. When you're ready to stand up for our relationship, when you're ready to demand that your wife treat me with the dignity I've earned, call me. Until then, I'll be at home, surrounded by people who know my worth. Margaret walked back down the brick pathway toward her car, leaving her son standing in the doorway of the house she had built for his happiness. Behind her, she could hear David's ragged breathing, the sound of a man finally understanding the weight of his choices. The roses she had planted swayed in the morning breeze, their blooms heavy with the scent of truth finally spoken. Whatever happened next, Margaret had reclaimed her voice and her dignity. The rest was up to David. The foundation had been laid. Now they would see what kind of family could be built upon it. David spent the day staring at the blueprints scattered across their coffee table like accusatory evidence. Every line Margaret had drawn, every measurement she had calculated, every careful notation about window placement and electrical outlets told the story of a mother's love translated into lumber and nails. He traced the penciled dimensions with his finger, recognizing his own handwriting in the margins where he had noted Rebecca's preferences. R wants marble countertops. R prefers subway tile backsplash. R loves the idea of a walk-in pantry. His mother had incorporated every single suggestion. By 5:30, David had worked himself into a state of anxious determination that felt foreign after months of conflict avoidance. He had rehearsed conversations, practiced explanations, and steeled himself for what he knew would be one of the most difficult discussions of his marriage. When Rebecca's key turned in the front door, he was sitting in the living room with the blueprints arranged on the coffee table like a presentation he was about to give to his most important client. "David, why are all the lights off?" Rebecca's voice carried its usual end-of-workday exhaustion, the particular weariness of someone who had spent 8 hours managing marketing campaigns and office politics. "And what's all that paperwork?" She appeared in the living room doorway, still wearing her navy blazer and the heels that clicked authoritatively across hardwood floors. David watched her take in the scene, the blueprints, the construction photographs, his unusual positioning, in what was normally her preferred chair. "We need to talk," David said, the words coming out more firmly than he had expected. Rebecca's expression shifted to the careful neutrality she employed when sensing potential conflict. She set down her purse and approached the coffee table, her eyes scanning the documents with the professional assessment of someone accustomed to reviewing presentations. "What is all this?" David picked up the original blueprint, the one with Margaret's handwriting in the corner. "These are the architectural plans for our house." "Okay," Rebecca said slowly, settling onto the edge of the sofa. "David, you're kind of freaking me out. What's going on?" "Rebecca, my mother's company didn't just build our house, they designed it, specifically for us, as a wedding gift." The words hung in the air like a confession. David watched his wife's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like betrayal. "What do you mean, wedding gift?" David pulled out the photograph of Margaret installing kitchen hardware, her hands working with the practiced precision of 30 years in construction. "I mean, my mother spent 6 months designing every detail of this house with our lives in mind. The kitchen island height, the office lighting, the extra soundproofing in the bedroom. All of it was planned specifically for us." Rebecca stared at the photograph, then at the blueprints, then back at David. "That's impossible. We bought this house. We have a mortgage. We have paperwork." "Check our bank statements from September," David interrupted. 3 days after our wedding, Chen and Associates deposited the full purchase price back into our account, listed as a wedding gift refund. Rebecca's face went through several expressions at once: surprise, calculation, and then something that looked dangerously like anger. "You knew about this?" "I arranged it. I handled all the contracts and paperwork to keep it a surprise until the wedding. And then? David felt heat rise in his cheeks. And then I never told you. The silence that followed felt dangerous, like the moment before a storm breaks. Rebecca stood up and began pacing to the bay window, her heels clicking, against the floors Margaret had personally selected and installed. "Let me get this straight," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the clipped precision she used in difficult client meetings. "Your mother built our house as a gift, and you never thought to mention this to me?" "I was going to tell you right after the wedding, but then..." "But then what, David?" Rebecca spun around, her carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. "But then you decided I didn't need to know that we were living in charity housing?" "It's not charity. It's..." "Not charity?" Rebecca's voice climbed an octave. "David, we've been living in a house your mother built for us, and I've been telling everyone about how we found our dream home through perfect timing and market luck. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" David felt a familiar urge to apologize, to smooth over the conflict, to find some compromise that would make everyone happy. But Margaret's words from that morning echoed in his mind. Love without respect is not enough to build a family on. More humiliating than the "way you've been treating my mother?" he asked. Rebecca stopped pacing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you uninvited her from our housewarming party, Rebecca. You uninvited my mother from a party celebrating a house she built with her own hands. I uninvited her because she doesn't fit in with our social circle. Because she's..." Rebecca paused, clearly searching for diplomatically acceptable language. "She's what?" "She's difficult, David. She's old-fashioned. She has strong opinions about everything, and she makes people uncomfortable with all her stories about immigration and construction work. I was trying to create a sophisticated evening for our peers, not a family reunion." David stared at his wife, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since their wedding. The beautiful, ambitious woman he had fallen in love with, whose confidence and social ease had seemed like the perfect complement to his more reserved nature. But now he could see the casual cruelty underneath, the dismissive attitude toward anyone who didn't fit her carefully curated image of success. "She makes people uncomfortable," David repeated slowly. "My mother, who built a construction empire from nothing, who gave us this house as an expression of love, makes people uncomfortable." "David, you know what I mean." "No, Rebecca, I..." "Don't think I do. Explain it to me." Rebecca sat back down, her hands smoothing her skirt with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was finally realizing the precarious position she had put herself in. "Look, I'm not saying your mother isn't accomplished. She obviously is. But she's from a different generation, a different background. When she talks about her work, it's all very manual labor, very blue-collar. That's not the image we're trying to project." "The image we're trying to project," David repeated. "And what image is that, exactly?" "Young, successful professionals. People who've earned their place through education and career advancement, not through..." She gestured vaguely at the blueprints. "Not through building things with their hands?" "David, you know I didn't mean it like that." But David was beginning to understand that she had meant it exactly like that. Rebecca's discomfort with Margaret wasn't about personality clashes or generational differences. It was about class, about respectability, about the subtle prejudices that separated white-collar success from blue-collar achievement. "My mother immigrated to this country with nothing," David said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She learned construction from my father, built a business that employs 40 people, and has probably forgotten more about hard work than most of our friends will ever know. And you're embarrassed by her." "I'm not embarrassed. You are. You're embarrassed by her accent, by her stories, by the fact that she works with her hands instead of sitting in an office. You're embarrassed by where I come from, Rebecca." The accusation hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they wanted to cross. Rebecca's face flushed, and for a moment, David thought she might deny it, might find some way to reframe her behavior as something more acceptable. Instead, she said, "Maybe I am." The honesty was startling in its cruelty. David felt something shift inside his chest, like a foundation settling into a new configuration. "Then we have a problem," he said quietly. Before Rebecca could respond, the doorbell rang. David ignored it, but the ringing continued, followed by knocking and a familiar voice calling through the door. "Rebecca? David? I saw your cars in the driveway. I wanted to talk to you about something." Sarah Kim, Rebecca's best friend and frequent companion, probably arriving to dissect the previous night's party or plan their next social venture. "We should answer that," Rebecca said, standing up with obvious relief at the interruption. "We should finish this conversation." "David, please. Sarah won't go away, and this will just take a minute." Against his better judgment, David followed Rebecca to the front door. Sarah stood on the porch holding a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of carefully casual outfit that suggested she had planned this visit to look spontaneous. "Hi, you two. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, but I wanted to bring you this wine to say thank you for last night. The party was amazing." Sarah's smile faltered as she took in their expressions. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Rebecca said quickly. "We were just—" "Actually, everything's not fine," David interrupted. "Rebecca, tell Sarah whose company built our house." Rebecca's face went pale. "David, this isn't the time. Tell her." Sarah looked between them, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Built your house? What do you mean?" David watched his wife struggle with the truth, saw her weighing the social implications of the revelation against the consequences of continued deception. "David's mother's construction company built the house," Rebecca said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Chen's company? I didn't know she owned a construction company." "Chen and Associates," David said, "one of the most respected construction firms in the Bay Area, and they built this house specifically for us, as a wedding gift." The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah's face like a slowly dawning realization. David could see her connecting dots, remembering conversations, understanding implications. "So when you said you found the perfect house on the market," Sarah began. "I lied," Rebecca said flatly. "Or rather, I didn't know the truth." Sarah looked around the entryway, taking in details with new eyes. "Mrs. Chen built this house for you, and last night, at the housewarming party—" "She wasn't invited," David finished. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went through several expressions: surprise, understanding, and then something that looked like horror. "Rebecca," Sarah said slowly, "you uninvited David's mother from a party celebrating a house she built for you?" "It's more complicated than that," Rebecca began. But Sarah was already shaking her head. "No, it's really not. Oh my God, Rebecca, what have you done?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. David watched his wife realize that her actions, exposed to the light of day and the judgment of a friend, looked exactly as cruel as they were. "I didn't know about the house," Rebecca said defensively. "David never told me." "But you knew she was his mother," Sarah replied. "You knew she raised him, supported him, loved him, and you've been treating her like an embarrassment." "Sarah, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. I've been listening to you complain about Mrs. Chen for months, and I've been too much of a coward to tell you how wrong you sounded." Sarah's voice was gaining strength, as if she had been holding back these words for a long time. "David's mother is kind, generous, and accomplished, and you've been acting like she's some burden you have to tolerate." David felt a surge of gratitude towards Sarah, This unexpected ally who was saying things he had been too afraid to voice himself. "Rebecca," Sarah continued, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. If Mrs. Chen were white, if she spoke without an accent, if she worked in an office instead of on construction sites, would you have treated her differently?" The question hit like a physical blow. David saw Rebecca's face cycle through denial, anger, and then something that might have been recognition. "That's not fair," Rebecca said finally. "Isn't it?" Sarah asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been discriminating against a woman who has shown you nothing but kindness. And you've been doing it based on prejudices you're too proud to acknowledge." David watched his wife grapple with this accusation, saw her weighing her self-image against the evidence of her behavior. For months, he had made excuses for Rebecca's treatment of his mother, had convinced himself that it was just personality, conflicts or adjustment difficulties. But Sarah's words stripped away those comfortable rationalizations, revealing the ugly truth underneath. "I'm not a racist," Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not intentionally," Sarah replied. "But impact matters more than intent, doesn't it? And the impact of your behavior has been to exclude and demean a woman who deserved your respect." Rebecca sank onto the bottom step of the staircase Margaret had designed with a careful rise and run calculation, her perfect posture finally collapsing under the weight of uncomfortable truths. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. David looked at his wife, really looked at her, and felt something that might have been pity. Rebecca had built her life around image and social positioning, around being the kind of person who belonged in the right circles and said the right things. But that careful construction had required her to reject anything that didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptability, including the woman who had made their entire life together possible. "You fix it by taking responsibility," David said, quietly. "You fix it by acknowledging what you've done and making amends, and you fix it by changing." "But what if I can't?" Rebecca asked, and for the first time since he had known her, she sounded genuinely vulnerable. "What if this is just who I am?" David thought about his mother's words that morning. "You fix it by deciding what kind of man you want to be." The same choice faced Rebecca now. She could continue being the woman who had uninvited Margaret from the housewarming party, or she could become someone else. Someone better. "Then we have a bigger problem than I thought," David said. Sarah cleared her throat awkwardly. "I should probably go. This is obviously a conversation you two need to have privately." She handed the wine to David and headed back toward her car, pausing at the edge of the brick walkway Margaret had designed for durability and beauty. "For what it's worth," Sarah called back, "Mrs. Chen is lucky to have a son who's finally willing to fight for her." After Sarah left, David and Rebecca sat in silence in the entryway of the house Margaret had built with such love and care. Around them, every detail spoke of thoughtful planning and generous hearts. The custom built-ins, the carefully positioned windows, the hardwood floors that had been laid with precision and pride. "I need to apologize to your mother," Rebecca said finally. "Yes, you do. I need to invite her to dinner. Here, in the house she built for us." "Yes, you do. And I need to examine some things about myself that I've been avoiding." David looked at his wife. This woman he had loved enough to marry, but apparently not enough to defend when it mattered most. Maybe this crisis would change her, would force her to confront the prejudices that had made her cruel to the most important woman in his life. Maybe she would learn to see Margaret the way Sarah did, the way she deserved to be seen. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe this conversation would fade into defensiveness and rationalization. Maybe Rebecca would find ways to justify her behavior and return to the comfortable prejudices that had shaped her treatment of Margaret. But either way, David knew he was done making excuses, done choosing the path of least resistance. done being the kind of son who let his mother be disrespected for the sake of domestic peace. The blueprints still lay scattered across their coffee table, evidence of love made manifest in careful planning and skilled craftsmanship. Tomorrow, David would call his mother and begin the long work of rebuilding what his silence had allowed to be damaged. Tonight, he and Rebecca would figure out whether their marriage was strong enough to survive the truth about who they really were. The house Margaret had built waited around them, solid and beautiful and true. Whatever happened next, it would endure. Rebecca hadn't slept. She had lain in the bed Margaret had designed for their comfort. Staring at the ceiling Margaret had carefully planned to the perfect height, listening to David's steady breathing and wrestling with the weight of her own actions. Every detail of the house seemed to whisper accusations in the darkness. The custom closet that held her clothes, the bathroom vanity positioned at exactly the right height, the window placement that caught the morning light just as she liked. All of it built by the woman she had systematically excluded from their lives. At 7 a.m., Rebecca gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen Margaret had designed around her cooking preferences. She made coffee using the machine David had given her for Christmas, standing at the marble countertops she had specifically requested. Looking out the window Margaret had positioned to provide the perfect view of the garden where she had planted roses that connected their family to a story Rebecca had never bothered to learn. When her phone rang at 8:15, Sarah's name on the screen, Rebecca almost didn't answer. The conversation from the night before had left her feeling raw and exposed, like someone had peeled back her skin to reveal something ugly underneath. "I'm coming over," Sarah said without preamble. "We need to talk." "Sarah, I'm already in your driveway." 20 minutes later, they sat at the kitchen island Margaret had built, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them. Sarah had brought a manila folder that she placed on the counter with the gravity of someone presenting evidence. "I went home last night and couldn't stop thinking about what you said," Sarah began. "About not knowing how to fix this, about whether you could change. So I did some research." Rebecca's stomach clenched. "Research?" Sarah opened the folder and pulled out printouts from the internet. News articles, business profiles, construction, industry awards. Chen and Associates Construction, founded 1995 by Margaret Chen, specializes in custom residential and commercial construction. 42 employees. Revenue last year of $12 million. Rebecca stared at the papers, seeing her mother-in-law's professional life laid out in corporate achievements and industry recognition. "This article is from last year," Sarah continued, pulling out a profile from a business magazine. "It's about women entrepreneurs in the construction industry. Listen to this. Margaret Chen immigrated to the United States in 1985 with basic English and a determination to build something lasting. After learning construction skills from her late husband, she founded Chen and Associates and has since become one of the Bay Area's most respected general contractors." Sarah looked up from the article. "Rebecca, David's mother isn't just successful. She's extraordinary, and you've been treating her like she's some kind of embarrassment." Rebecca felt heat creep up her neck. "I know that now." "Do you? Because there's more." Sarah pulled out another article, this one from a local newspaper. "This is from 3 years ago. Local construction company builds homes for Habitat for Humanity. Margaret donated her company's services to build 3 houses for low-income families. No charge. The evidence kept coming. Awards for workplace safety, recognition for mentoring women in trades, a scholarship fund Margaret had established for children of immigrant families pursuing construction careers. Each achievement was another weight, added to Rebecca's growing understanding of exactly who she had been dismissing. "She's not just David's mother," Sarah said quietly. "She's a pillar of this community. She's accomplished more than most people dream of, and she's done it while maintaining her values and helping others along the way." Rebecca pushed the papers away, unable to look at any more evidence of Margaret's worth. Why are you showing me this? Because I think you need to understand what you almost threw away, what you almost made David throw away. The words hit like a physical blow. Rebecca thought about the months of slights and exclusions, the casual dismissals and deliberate uninvitations. She thought about Margaret's patient dignity in the face of each insult, the way she had continued to be kind even as Rebecca systematically pushed her away. "I've been horrible," Rebecca whispered. "Yes, you have. But the question is what you're going to do about it." While Rebecca grappled with her revelations, David sat in his mother's living room, surrounded by the familiar comfort of home but feeling like a stranger. Margaret moved around the kitchen with her usual efficiency, preparing tea and arranging cookies on a plate as if this were a normal social visit instead of the most important conversation of their relationship. "You don't have to apologize again," Margaret said, settling into her chair with the careful grace of someone who had learned to carry herself with dignity under all circumstances. "You've already done that." "But I do, Mom. I need you to understand how sorry I am for letting it get this far." Margaret studied her son's face, seeing the genuine remorse but also something else. A new strength, perhaps, or a clearer understanding of what he was willing to fight for. "David, apologies are important, but they're not enough. What I need from you is assurance that this kind of disrespect will never happen again." David leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "It won't. I promise you it won't. But I need to know. Can you forgive me? Can you forgive Rebecca?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "Forgiveness isn't a switch I can flip, honey. It's a process. And it requires more than apologies. It requires genuine change. Rebecca wants to invite you to dinner. She wants to apologize properly." "I'm sure she does. But David, I need you to understand something about boundaries." Margaret stood and walked to the window that overlooked her garden, where roses bloomed in defiant beauty despite the recent emotional storms. "For 30 years, I have built my life around your happiness. I sacrificed my own comfort, my own social life, my own needs to make sure you had every opportunity. And somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the fact that I deserve respect, not just love." David felt his chest tighten. "Mom, you've always had my respect." "Have I?" "Because your actions suggest otherwise. Respect means protecting someone from harm, David. It means refusing to let them be treated poorly, even when standing up for them is difficult or uncomfortable." The words stung because they were true. David thought about all the times he had made excuses for Rebecca's behavior, all the moments when he could have said something and chose silence instead. "What do I need to do to earn it back?" he asked. Margaret turned from the window, her expression softening slightly. "You need to prove that you understand the difference between keeping peace and avoiding conflict. You need to show me that you're willing to have difficult conversations when they matter. And you need to accept that Rebecca's apology, when it comes, needs to be backed up by lasting change in how she treats me." "And if she can't change?" Margaret's face remained calm, but David could see the steel underneath. "Then you'll have a choice to make about what kind of family you want to be part of." That evening, Elena Rodriguez and Tommy Chen sat at Margaret's dining table, sharing the kind of meal that had sustained relationships through decades of challenges. Elena had brought wine and her characteristic directness, while Tommy had arrived with flowers and barely contained anger at Rebecca's behavior. "I still think you should have let me talk to her," Tommy said, stabbing his fork into the stir-fry with unnecessary force. "Some people need to be told exactly what they are." "Tommy," Margaret said mildly, "violence has never solved family problems." "I didn't say anything about violence. I said talking, very clearly and specifically." Elena laughed despite the tension. "Your cousin has a gift for diplomatic intimidation. Remember when that contractor tried to stiff us on the Menlo Park job? That was different, Tommy protested. That was business. This is family. Exactly, Margaret said. And family relationships require more finesse than contractor disputes? They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Three people who had built their professional lives around the principle that strong foundations required patience and careful work. How are you really doing with all this? Elena asked eventually. Margaret considered the question seriously. I'm proud of myself for finally speaking up. I'm sad that it took so long. And I'm cautiously hopeful that real change might be possible. And if it's not? Then I'll continue building the life I want with the people who respect me. David will always be my son, but I won't sacrifice my dignity for anyone's comfort anymore. Tommy raised his wine glass. To foundations that can't be shaken. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Rebecca stood on Mrs. Patterson's front porch, holding a small bouquet and working up the courage to ring the doorbell. The older woman answered promptly as if she had been watching from the window. Rebecca, dear. What a surprise. Mrs. Patterson, I hope I'm not intruding. I brought these flowers, and I was wondering if we could talk. Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes assessed Rebecca with the thoroughness of someone who had spent decades reading the motivations of young people. About Margaret, I assume? Yes, ma'am. Come in, then. I'll make tea. Mrs. Patterson's living room was filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life. Family photographs, books, mementos from travels and celebrations. Rebecca sat carefully on the edge of an antique sofa, feeling like a child called to account for her behavior. I suppose you've learned about the house, Mrs. Patterson said, settling into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose body required negotiation. Yes, I had no idea that Margaret built it for us. And now you're feeling guilty. The directness was startling. Rebecca had expected polite conversation, diplomatic dancing around the issues. Instead, Mrs. Patterson cut straight to the heart of things. Yes, I'm feeling terrible about how I've treated her. Good, you should. Mrs. Patterson poured tea, with steady hands. But feeling guilty isn't enough, dear. The question is whether you're capable of genuine change. Rebecca accepted her teacup gratefully, needing something to do with her hands. I don't know. I hope so. Hope is a start, but change requires understanding why you behaved as you did in the first place. Mrs. Patterson's gaze was penetrating. The look of someone who had spent 40 years getting children to confess their real motivations. I think I was threatened by her, Rebecca admitted. Margaret is so accomplished, so respected, and David clearly adores her. I felt like I could never measure up to that relationship, so you tried to diminish it instead of finding your own place within it. The observation was painfully accurate. Rebecca had felt intimidated by Margaret's history with David, by the obvious love and respect between them, by the way David's face lit up when he talked about his mother's achievements. Instead of finding ways to appreciate that relationship, she had tried to minimize its importance. Margaret didn't raise David to replace her with a wife, Mrs. Patterson continued. She raised him to love fully and honor the people who deserve it. There was room for both of you in his heart, if you had been generous enough to allow it. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. How do I fix this? Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. You start by being honest about your motivations. You acknowledge the harm you've caused. You make specific changes in how you treat Margaret going forward. And you accept that earning forgiveness takes time. What if she can't forgive me? Then you'll have learned something important about the consequences of cruelty, Mrs. Patterson said matter-of-factly. But Margaret Chen is one of the most generous people I've ever known. If you approach her with genuine humility and real change, I suspect she'll give you a chance. After leaving Mrs. Patterson's house, Rebecca drove through the quiet suburban streets, past other homes that might have been built by Margaret's company, other families living in structures shaped by her skill and vision. For the first time, Rebecca tried to imagine what it would feel like to build something with your own hands, to create homes where families would live and love and grow. When she arrived back at 1247 Sycamore Drive, the house Margaret had built, for their happiness, David was waiting in the living room with the blueprint still spread across the coffee table. "How did it go?" he asked. Rebecca sat beside him, looking at the careful pencil lines that represented months of planning and, I understand now, not just about the house, but about what I've been doing and why. And I want to invite your mother to dinner. Here, in the house she built for us. I want to apologize properly, and I want to start over if she'll let me." David studied his wife's face, looking for signs of the defensiveness and rationalization that had characterized her earlier responses. Instead, he saw something that looked like genuine remorse and, perhaps more importantly, determination to do better. "She might not be ready for that yet," he warned. "Then I'll wait until she is. And I'll keep working to become the kind of person who deserves her forgiveness." Outside, the roses Margaret had planted swayed in the evening breeze, their blooms heavy with the promise of new growth. Change was possible, but it required the same patience and careful tending that all beautiful things demanded. The foundation had been shaken, but it was still strong enough to build upon. Whether the family that emerged from this crisis would be stronger than what came before remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, there was hope for something better than what they had been settling for. The work of rebuilding had begun. Rebecca stared at her phone for 20 minutes before sending the text. She had written and deleted a dozen versions, each one feeling either too casual or too formal, too brief or too lengthy. Finally, she settled on something that felt honest without being overwhelming. "Mrs. Chen, I would very much like the opportunity to apologize to you in person and to start over if you're willing. Would you be available for coffee sometime this week? I understand if you're not ready for that yet." Rebecca. She hit send before she could change her mind again, then spent the next hour cleaning the house with nervous energy, as if scrubbing. The kitchen counters Margaret had designed could somehow erase the months of poor behavior that had led to this moment. Margaret's response came 3 hours later. "Thursday at 2 p.m., Café Luna on University Avenue. Margaret." No warmth, but no rejection either. Rebecca would take it. Thursday afternoon found Rebecca arriving at Café Luna 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the window where she could watch for Margaret's arrival while having something to look at if the conversation became too uncomfortable. She had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple blue sweater and jeans, professional enough to show respect, casual enough to suggest she wasn't trying too hard. Margaret arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, wearing slacks and a blazer that spoke of someone who had come directly from a business meeting. She moved through the cafe with the quiet confidence Rebecca was beginning to recognize as characteristic, scanning the room until she spotted Rebecca at the window table. "Thank you for coming," Rebecca said as Margaret approached. "You're welcome." Margaret settled into the chair across from her with careful precision. "Should we order first?" They navigated the awkwardness of ordering coffee. Margaret chose black coffee, Rebecca a vanilla latte, and made small talk about parking and the weather until their drinks arrived. Then they sat in silence for a moment, both women apparently uncertain how to begin a conversation that felt simultaneously overdue and premature. "I owe you an enormous apology," Rebecca said finally. "And I need you to know that it took me far too long to understand exactly what I was apologizing for." Margaret sipped her coffee and waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging the explanation. "I thought I was just managing social dynamics," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing. "I told myself that you and I just had different styles, different backgrounds, different approaches to family relationships, but that wasn't what was happening. What was happening? Margaret asked quietly. Rebecca met her eyes, forcing herself to maintain contact despite the discomfort. I was threatened by you, by your relationship with David, by your accomplishments, by the respect you've earned. And instead of dealing with my own insecurities, I tried to diminish your importance in David's life. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither woman was sure they wanted to cross. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but Rebecca thought she saw something shift in her eyes. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps recognition of honesty. Can you tell me about your business? Rebecca asked, surprising herself with the question. I mean, really tell me. I realize I've never asked you about your work beyond polite pleasantries. Margaret studied Rebecca's face, clearly assessing whether this interest was genuine or performative. Whatever she saw, there must have satisfied her, because she began to speak about Chen and Associates with the quiet pride of someone who had built something meaningful. I started the company in 1995 with 2 employees, myself and a contractor who was willing to take a chance on a woman with more determination than experience. We specialized in residential work because commercial projects required relationships and reputations I hadn't had time to build yet. Rebecca found herself genuinely interested as Margaret described the early challenges: language barriers with suppliers, skeptical clients who questioned her expertise, the physical demands of construction work that she had met through sheer stubbornness and careful attention to safety protocols. The first house I built from foundation to finish took 8 months, Margaret continued. It should have taken 4, but I was learning as I went, making mistakes and fixing them until everything was perfect. The family still sends me Christmas cards. How did you learn? I mean, construction isn't exactly a field with obvious entry points for women. Margaret smiled slightly, the first genuine warmth Rebecca had seen from her during this conversation. My husband James taught me the basics. He was a Finnish carpenter, beautiful work, very precise. But I learned most of it by doing, by asking questions, by refusing to accept that there were things I couldn't figure out. Rebecca thought about her own career path: MBA program, marketing firm internship, steady advancement through corporate structures that, while competitive, had clear rules and expectations. She couldn't imagine the courage it would take to enter an industry where you had to prove yourself every day to people who assumed you didn't belong. It must have been incredibly difficult. Everything worthwhile is difficult, Margaret said, matter-of-factly. The question is whether you're willing to do the work. They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually becoming less stilted as Rebecca asked genuine questions, and Margaret shared stories about projects that had challenged her, employees she was proud of, the satisfaction of creating something lasting with your own hands. Rebecca found herself admiring this woman she had dismissed, seeing for the first time the intelligence and determination that had built an empire from nothing. Can I ask you something personal? Rebecca said as they prepared to leave. Margaret nodded. What was it like when David told you he was getting married? Were you worried about sharing him? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I was worried about whether you would love him well, she said finally. Whether you would appreciate what kind of man I had tried to raise. Whether you would support his dreams or expect him to fit into yours. The honesty stung, but Rebecca appreciated it. And what do you think now? I think you love him, but I think you've been asking him to choose between us instead of finding a way for both relationships to exist. Margaret gathered her purse, preparing to stand. Love isn't a competition, Rebecca. There's room for everyone to matter. As they walked toward the cafe door, Rebecca felt a strange mixture of hope and trepidation. The conversation hadn't magically erased months of poor behavior, but it had created something that felt like possibility. Mrs. Chen, Rebecca said as they reached the sidewalk, would you be willing to come to dinner at the house? I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to cook for you in the kitchen you designed." Margaret studied Rebecca's face for a long moment. "When? Sunday, 6 o'clock, just the three of us?"